All right, well, welcome everyone. My name's Nathan Alexander. I'm the project manager with the Non-Religion in a Complex Future project. So this is the latest in our webinar series, Non-Religion, Past and Present, Interdisciplinary Conversations. And this series is co-hosted by the Non-Religion in a Complex Future project and the International Society for Historians of Atheism, Secularism, and Humanism. And the goal of the webinar series is really to bring together historians and social scientists to try to, encourage collaboration, encourage learning from each other, and so on. So before we start, I wanted to do a brief land acknowledgement for us here in Ottawa. So the Non-Religion in a Complex Future project is based at the University of Ottawa in Ottawa, Canada. Please join us as we pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders past, present, and future. So now I'll introduce our four speakers, and then I'll turn it over to Claire to lead the discussion. Callum Brown is Professor Emeritus in History at the University of Glasgow. He has written 14 books and over 60 articles and book chapters. He's pioneered a variety of methodologies in studying secularization, postmodernism and the death of Christian Britain, demographic statistics in religion and the demographic revolution, oral history in becoming atheist, and conflict analysis in the battle for Christian Britain. And he's currently completing a Leverhulme research fellowship on ethical change and the rise of the atheist West. Hugo Rabbia is a researcher at the National Science and Technological Council, based at the Institute of Psychological Research at the National University of Córdoba in Argentina. His research interests are non-religion, politics, social attitudes, and sexual diversity. And he's the co-author of a book. Well, the title is in Spanish, but I'll give you the English translation. It's Religion as an Everyday Experience, Beliefs, Practices, and Spiritual Narratives in South America from 2019. And he also serves as full professor of political psychology at the Catholic University of Córdoba. Todd Weir is a historian whose research has illuminated different dimensions of the encounter between secularism and religion. He's the author of the books Secularism and Religion in 19th Century Germany, The Rise of the Fourth Confession from Cambridge University Press in 2014, and Red Secularism, Socialism and Secularist Culture in Germany 1890 to 1933, also from Cambridge University Press in 2023. And also in that year, he received a grant from the Dutch Research Council to carry out a collaborative research project on the history of Weltanschauung or worldview in the 19th and 20th centuries. And finally, we have Sarah Wilkins-Laflamme, who is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Legal Studies at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada. She specializes in sociology of religion, quantitative methods, immigration, race and ethnicity, political sociology, as well as social change. And her books include None of the Above, Non-Religious Identity in the U.S. and Canada, co-authored with Joel Thiessen and published in 2020 with New York University Press, and Religion, Spirituality, and Secularity Among Millennials, The Generation Shaping American and Canadian Trends, published in 2023 with Routledge. Okay, so now I'll turn it over to Claire Stainthorpe to lead the discussion.
Thanks so much, Nathan, for those introductions. Yes, so my name is Claire Stainthorpe. I'm one of the co-directors of ISHASH with Anton, who's also with us here today. So yeah, we're going to have a sort of somewhat structured, hopefully sort of first half hour or so of a conversation where we'll sort of move between the sort of four speakers, getting to sort of reflect on this idea of using statistics and data in different ways in their work, and then opening that out hopefully into a sort of more sort of discussion type, potentially Q&A, but certainly there'll be sort of very much sort of space and time for others to sort of pitch in with their reflections and sort of yeah, in whatever ways kind of come up during the course of the conversation. So we're going to start with a sort of an opening salvo of sorts. So the question I'd sort of posed to the speakers in advance was, tell us what kinds of statistical sources you use in your research and what sort of methods you use to try and get a sense of the kinds of people who are talking with us today. So we're going to hear from each of the speakers sort of reflect on that, and sort of starting then with Callum. And so I'm just going to share Callum's screen, and he's going to speak for sort of maybe 3 to 5 minutes, maybe, about yes, that this sort of opening salvo. And hopefully you can
Okay, hello
us.
everybody. Please excuse me in advance if I start coughing and spluttering. I've been fighting an infection for the last 6 weeks. Yeah, I've got statistics in my blood. I was brought up to study religion and secularization in a social sciences department at the University of Glasgow in the mid-1970s. So statistics are an automatic consequence, I think, of being taught in that kind of a department. And I cannot imagine studying this subject without the benefit of quantitative methods. Not every book I've written is quantitative in construction. A small number are, but it's not the only methodology I want to emphasize, but it is absolutely a vital tool in the toolbox. So general benefits of statistics, which are in some ways unique to statistical-led analysis of religion. First, they provide a universally understood proof. I mean, even if you don't understand statistics, you must be able to understand the level of proof that a table, a graph gives to your argument. They produce testable, accepted, and graduated levels of proof. For example, producing results in which one can say that there has been X percentage level of proof. Now that's something which is not possible in any other methodology. So that makes statistics really very handy. Next slide, please. Measuring. Statistics allow you to measure religion and non-religion, principally, I would argue, by 2 methods, time series or snapshot, which allow various things. A, establishing the character of religious change. Is secularization stronger or earlier amongst people of religion A compared to religion B? One of the general findings of the mid-20th century was the early collapse of religious practice and church membership amongst Protestants, Catholics delaying some 20, 25 years later. B, comparing places within a territory. It's one of the big questions when I started in the mid-1970s was the issue of is religion more suited to rural areas rather than to urban? I'll come back to that in a minute because that's how I cut my teeth. And C, comparing religious change across different nations. That's the most difficult to set up because different nations have recorded religion in different ways, which can be a real pain. But there are possibilities. Next, please. Causation. Okay. One of the distinctive features of statistics is the possibility of establishing the cause of religious change in a way which is testable and quantifiable. You can actually quantify how much you have proven that religious change is caused by certain factors. Not all of human life has been quantified, but one should explore what can be quantified. And the starting point is generally negative results. And I think it's the only part of our studies of religion and non-religion where negative results can loom very, very large because you're starting to cross things off, saying, yeah, that's not the cause. And my very first article in 1988, which is published in Urban History Yearbook 1988, I asked the question, the title was, did urbanization cause secularization? And I demonstrated using 1851 religious church-going census that bigger cities did not secularize more than smaller cities, which was a standard argument at the time and was just gaily used by really non-quantitative historians. So I felt that was a bit of a tick. 2 forms of causation can be tested. One is correlation, which changes one set of data in which one set of data can be said to be associated with changes in another set of data. Secondly, regression, in which changes in one set of data can be said to be caused by changes in another set of data. And in each of these two, thirdly, you can rank causes to see what are the most important. And my last, thank you. So it's worth testing lots of different types of social data, levels of prosperity, employment, gender. You can measure, for instance, women in employment, levels of marriage, levels of fertility, levels of education, so on. Virtually any type of demographic data, and you can correlate and hopefully regress these against levels of church going or levels of religious belief. And just to finish, the most important studies of the 19th and 20th centuries in terms of identifying cause of secularization have been, I would argue, a book which I did following on from a book by a Belgian social scientist. And then I was followed by Philip Jenkins at Baylor, where we studied the impact of fertility. Fertility came out as being the greatest single statistical cause of variation in levels of non-church going and non-religious belief. Philip Jenkins' work, if people don't know it, can I commend it to you? It's a book that looks at the impact of fertility upon faith on probably every nation in the world, which I only did 4 nations. He seemed to get people together who could read in different languages. I didn't have that kind of money to do that. But each of us, Jenkins and myself, have both shown that fertility is a remarkable predictor of levels of secularization. And there is a journal, special journal, Religion, Brain and Behavior, which looks at Jenkins's book in great detail. So I would commend that. I think that's all my slides, isn't it?
Yep. Yes, it is indeed. It is indeed. Thank you so much. I think that's opened out so many really fascinating potential pathways into sort of further discussion. Thank you for kicking us off, Callum. Hugo, I realise that, we haven't actually tested your mic, but can we hear you?
Hi, hello. Hi, Claire. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
I'm so sorry for the delay. I had problem with my computer, so I had to change it at the last minute. So sorry. Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation, Claire. Thank you, Nathan. Thank you all friends from Non-Religious Complex Future Project. The first thing that I have to say regarding this topic in the context of Latin America is that we have a say that is religious data is scarce in Latin America. Everyone who is asked about statistics of religion and religiosity in Latin America answer this way. This is somehow true, but it's also a false statement. First, it's true that we only have data from national census in 6 countries, and it has a lot of it has been criticized a lot about how this data is produced and the categories that they use for answer the question, what is your religion? But we have data from 6 countries. Not in the case of Argentina, but we have data from Brazil, Chile, for example, Peru, etc. And there is also, this is also a false statement because we also have a lot of data from several surveys for at least the last 25, 30 years. We are thinking about, for example, the World Value Survey, which have applied a lot of several waves in several Latin American countries since 1980s. We have to think about also the Latin barometer, which is a private study, but it's an yearly private survey, which asks about religion since 1995. And we also have several studies from different religious sociologists or research centers. The problem of these studies is that they are not necessarily comparable. There are several questions, different answers. Even the study from the same center, like the Universidad Católica Argentina, apply different phrases and questions and options for answers in each of their series. So, of course, we have problems on that. But if you want new and better data, we have to generate it. So that's why I think it's really important, the social and cultural value survey that we have working on in the context of the non-religious in a complex future project. If we want to think, explore, analyze long-term process, we have to be very creative because we don't have data from, for example, 1920 or 1950. So creativity is really a must. And of course, there are several forms to be innovative in terms of working with different data for long-term process analysis. But I want to share with you just one. Which was something that I made with a colleague, Gustavo Morello, who is working in Boston College. We try to identify when the process of decatholicization started in Argentina. You know, all last survey data said that there are fewer Catholics in most of Latin American countries, but Mexico and maybe Paraguay. But in the case of Argentina, we know that at least the 30 or 40% of people who was baptized do not identify as Catholics right now. And when this started, it's really some people said that it started in this new millennium, but we suspected that it was something that we could trace from at least 40 or 50 years ago. We didn't have data, survey data or census or data from census. So the only thing that we find that could serve as a marker or something to explore the Catholicization process in our context was to go to the registration of baptism. So Catholic baptism is strict practices, all of you probably know. Although it inscribes a person as part of a community of faithful, in 99% of cases, it is performed in the first months of the person's life. So it's not a decision of the person, it's a decision of the parents. So this data told us more about the religiosity of the former generation than the religiosity of the current people. And the most important is that baptism, as different as, for example, marriage, are registered in our context. We have registers of each baptism in each paroch or in each archiepiscopal archive. So we have the records. We could trace and reconstruct the number of baptisms in several cities in Argentina. In our cases, we applied this process for the second most populated city in Argentina, which is Córdoba. And also we could analyze the baptisms performed since 1914 to the last 4 years, comparing this data with the information of the civil registration of newborns. And that's helped us to identify that the process of decatholicization started at least in the last part of the decade of 1970s in Argentina. And of course, it was really increasing this process, the gap between newborns and people who were baptized. This gap was constantly increasing and was even bigger during the last 5 years. In 2013, the same year that Pope Francis was named Pope, which Argentina is his hometown, only 67% of the newborns from Córdoba were baptized, when in 1916, 99% were baptized. So that was a kind of innovative solution that we found to try to fill the gap of data for long-term observations. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Hugo. Yeah, that's so interesting to get a real sense of what creativity looks like in this context, and really wonderful to sort of get a sense of the outcomes as well.
Thank you.
Sorry, I think I'm not sure if I froze for a second. Apologies if so. So I think next we're going to move to Todd. So yeah, please go ahead, Todd.
Super. Thank you. Thank you, Claire and Nathan, for the invitation. I think I presented once in this forum before, and I'm also very happy to see Callum Brown here and Edward Royal, who I've never met, but I work on free thinkers, so I'm indebted to both of you. Very happy to have you present. So what I wanted to talk about was the use of digital humanities tools, which is a kind of a data analysis, sort of linguistic analysis, and how that can be used for historical research. I have been working now on this project on the history of worldview. So it's essentially a history of concepts project. And I had the good fortune to get a bit of funding. So I've hired a digital humanist, a philosopher, Hugo Hochenberg, and he's helping me with this. And I'm just going to present a little bit of how we're using digital humanities to, let's say, test some hypotheses that we developed just through regular old-fashioned textual research. So I'll put a couple slides up to look at. Okay. This one, that's working. Okay, so as people who study emergent phenomena, I mean, what is non-religion, right? It's this emergent field of like the constant production of new meaning at the boundary of religion and modernity, right? That's what we're all fascinated with. I assume. I think that's what we're all working with, right? What's going on at that sort of boundary, and so for social scientists, it's obviously really crucial that you do analysis of the concepts you're using, because our concepts are emerging along with the emergent phenomena. So we're constantly coming up with new terms. I think in this millennium, some favorites have been ontologies, worlding, world making, and worldviews, right? These are all terms that social scientists are gravitating towards. I've been working with Lois Lee, also be familiar to many of you, trying to put together a book on all of these sort of alternative conceptions that are now circulating to deal with precisely these border issues. And as a historian, of course, there's the added bonus of you go back in time and you look at the concepts to try to reveal things about the past boundaries and phenomena. So there's a double operation that goes on. And I was just thinking of an example of why it's important to do this around worldview, for example. If you look at these book titles, they're all about worldview or related topics. And there's the one there, Cosmovisión Andina. So the idea of the Andean or the indigenous worldview is risen in Latin America. Hugo could probably confirm this. In the last 20 years, is kind of become a sort of central category. And interestingly, in the land acknowledgement that Nathan read at the beginning, there was talk in there about the knowledge of the Algonquin people and how that was related to land claims. And that seems natural because he said it, and somehow it's a ritual utterance. But what is knowledge, right? Does it have anything to do with religion? And I would say probably it does, and it probably is mediated through the concept of worldview. So in Latin America, the claims to land are made in the name of cosmovision, of the worldview of indigenous people. The specific content isn't really so important. What's important is the claim to have a worldview, and that this worldview is distinct and total and autonomous. And I think the power of that claim comes through religion. So in this project, we're trying to study this historically. And we have this basic hypothesis, and which is that the meanings are largely not generated in the academy or philosophy, let's say, which is where people usually associate worldview. Rather, it's in the world of apologetic struggles, right? Culture wars. And in the case of indigenous rights movements, you could call it a kind of culture war of sorts. So the idea is that even though there's 20,000 definitions of worldview, and if you just turn on the news, you're going to get one about Trump's worldview. It could mean anything today. But if you look historically, our assumption is that there's a kind of narrowing that goes on of the concept of worldview in the 19th century from very disparate use to a binary around essentially religious and natural scientific worldview. So the question is, well, how can we use statistics of sorts, textual statistics, to come up with this? The first thing I just showed you, everyone can do these. I assume you most know how to do these Google Ngrams. They're fun to do. You're a digital researcher in 5 minutes with this tool. And I basically was curious, like, well, when is worldview popularized? And it's not popular for the first 40 years of its existence in Germany. It's really popularized in 1848, 1870. Those are the periods of culture wars in German history. So there's a kind of first indication that indeed worldview is being generated around culture wars. But then we wanted to sort of test it more. So we took a database of the Deutsches Textarchiv, which is a German text database. It's available to everybody. And we were looking for collates, sort of what words co-occur with the term worldview or Weltanschauung. And we found that in the early 19th century, indeed, it was very disparate. The collates are such things as philosophical, even secular, Mazzini, Aristophanes, many different uses. But by the late 19th century, the most popular collates were all about the science-religious binary. In fact, mostly about natural science, right? Materialism, mechanism, total, new, natural scientific. So this is a way to do some textual analysis using big data sets at very low cost. Like, we didn't download these data sets. You can find them online. There are many repositories, and some of them have these kind of text searching tools. So here's an example of a kind of easy digital humanities where you're accessing millions and millions of words. You have to pay attention to your corpus, right? Do you really know what's in it? But and then I'll just give one other quick example. So we were also interested in how the further argument is that in the 20th century, there are multiple camps in the worldviews of Europe, and each of them has a relationship to the concept of worldview. So in the Dutch case, surprisingly, perhaps, it's the Christian Orthodox who seized on the word worldview in the late 19th century. It had been associated with natural science, and you would find in the mid-20th century, liberals and natural scientists saying worldview was theirs. Our worldview is dominant. But by the late 19th century, you have a very influential Dutch theologian, Abraham Kuyper. He's the leader of the first political party called the Anti-Revolutionary Party. He's a theologian. He founds a university. He's also Prime Minister of the Netherlands in 1904. And he makes the claim that, that the schools should be desecularized, that they should confessionalize schooling on the basis of freedom of worldview. So it's a kind of clever thing where he grasps at this term that is comparative and apparently neutral to argue that the state has a worldview and Christians have a worldview, and each one should have their own school, right? So state schools are secular, fine, but the Christians get a worldview, Protestants get theirs, Catholics get theirs. And he's successful, and this leads to the so-called pillarization of the Netherlands, which is only, and I was surprised to find this out, it's only from 1917, this pillarization, as a legal constitutional arrangement. But what's interesting is that we then took parliamentary records, which have good metadata, and we looked for worldview, and we could chart who's using it, which political parties are using it in parliamentary debate. And this document shows you that liberals don't like it, they don't use it, they underuse it. The Reformed Protestants are the major users in parliamentary speech of worldview because they have a lasting affinity for it as the justification for the pillarization that benefits their theological political position. Catholics are friendly towards worldview because they also benefit from this confessionalized school system. And socialists start off apparently being very much into worldview, but they became eventually, like the liberals, anti-worldview. So it's another type of statistical analysis that one can do relatively easily. So the whole point was that this was ways of, let's say, testing the hypotheses that we developed through the kind of traditional intellectual history. So thank you.
Thanks, Todd. That's really, really helpful. And thinking about these sort of different kinds of data and the way that digital humanities sort of gives us other ways to think about that. And so finally, we have Sarah. So Sarah, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So I've been specializing in quantitative methods my whole career, and I've always really enjoyed them because they're one good way of going out and seeing what real people, everyday people across a whole population think and do, right? And I mean, that's data that we have now since especially the mid-20th century that we didn't necessarily have before, right? If you're thinking in a historical perspective, a lot of the history we have is coming from political leaders, faith leaders, people in power telling us how things were. But now we can actually go and see how they really were with people, at least in certain ways. And so I've always loved statistics for that. I mean, my main area of expertise is survey data. So I use a lot of survey data, different kinds. So some survey data that I collect myself or as part of teams. So for example, I run the International Social Survey Program here in Canada. It's kind of like the World Values Survey, but more on kind of specific thematic modules in the social sciences, and especially in political science and sociology and economy. And so I've had a really fun view of the insides of gathering that information, and the ISSP is this kind of big cross-national project. I also run smaller surveys here in Canada, for example, that millennial survey that I ran in 2019 that my last book was based on. But I also use a lot of existing data that others have collected as well, right? And so, for example, Hugo mentioned the NCF survey that we ran as part of this project in 2023, but also, data that the Government of Canada, for example, puts out. Our census has a religious affiliation question that goes back to the middle of the 19th century here, so we have a nice long time series for that. Also, just more recently, our general social surveys that have been running since the 1980s. And as well as other research groups who put out open data. I'm always very thankful for those who gather the data and then make it open access to everyone. So groups like the Pew Research Center makes a lot of their data open access, right? Hugo mentioned the World Values Survey, or we could also add to that the European Values Survey. So lots of survey data that I've used over the years. I've also used the more institutional level church data, kind of like what Hugo was talking about. So this is where churches gather their own, how many people they baptize a year, how many marriages do they perform, how many funerals, their financial data, etc. So we have some pretty good stuff here in Canada. Not all of it is digitized, so sometimes you actually have to physically go go to the archive in person still, and that's always that's the little historical side of me that comes out once in a while. But in more recent years, it's been mainly survey data. And the techniques that I use to analyze and crunch that data are pretty varied, all the way from a lot of more what we call descriptive basic work, especially for audiences who don't have a whole lot of expertise in the statistics. Sometimes just a key percentage or a key average can really be impactful or meaningful and show what is that you want to kind of show as a key finding, all the way to kind of more advanced techniques. So things like latent class analysis, structural equation modeling, hierarchical linear modeling, I've been trained to do. I love picking up a few new ones every so often. So I'm working for the first time on event history analysis now, which is always exciting. And I think what I've found in more recent years is I've also been putting a lot of time and effort into finding ways to communicate statistics to wider audiences, right? I mean, there's a small, wonderful group of people who know what they're talking about when it comes to statistics. And then there's everyone else and who are exposed to a lot of statistics, but don't necessarily always know all the going behinds and everything there is to know. And so how to kind of communicate key findings to those audiences. So if we're talking about on social media, in podcasts, in video bites, as well as obviously in journal articles and books. And so it's kind of how to translate not only the kind of basic findings, like from basic descriptive statistics, which is easier to do. Most people know what a percentage or average is, but also the findings from more complex models is how do you actually present them in a way people understand what the heck you're talking about. And so, yeah, that's kind of been one of the things I've been focused on. And I think if we're looking at cross-disciplinary discussions here is probably very important when it comes to kind of interactions and research projects between social scientists and historians. Because I mean, some historians have statistical training, and that's one, and I'm really impressed by that. A lot don't. And so it's also kind of how do you work with people who don't have a huge amount of expertise, but also who are really enthusiastic and can really bring something to table in terms of the historical context and everything that's going on around these numbers, and how do we work together, right? So that's things I've been thinking of throughout my career with stats. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Sarah. So I'm really aware that sort of time is ticking on, and I don't want to sort of not let us have the kind of in conversation part of what I know is sort of this has been advertised as. So I wonder whether instead of kind of other questions or prompts that I'd sort of given to the speakers were around particular sort of data sets or sort of things that people might not be aware of that might be useful to kind of share. And I think actually some of the things Sarah was saying there has already kind of started to point to this, as well as, Hugo on that idea of sort of creativity and sort of how we might sort of trace these through historical records. And then we've also the other question was around sort of historians and social scientists working together and collaborating. And I think also we're getting elements of that too. So while I think rather than kind of going through each person sort of 2 more times, and I think that would run out the clock, I wonder instead whether there is anything that in the first instance any of our 4 speakers wants to either respond to one of the other ones, something that they've said, or wanted to ask them questions. And maybe if we start the conversation between those 4, just to kind of sort of start opening things out, if that's okay. If you wanted to either raise a physical hand or a digital hand.
Claire, if I might say so, I think we should give
Yes.
others attending a chance to speak.
Okay, yes, thank you, Callum. All right, well, in that case, yes, let's open the floor and get a conversation going. Nathan, go ahead.
I have a question if as others think about their questions. Well, one thing, I mean, even Sarah mentioned this in her last one, just about historians not having statistical training, and I think that's probably true. I kind of wanted to ask generally all the panelists, for a future, like if you're designing like a university curriculum for anyone in the humanities or social sciences, like what sort of statistical training would you want them to have if would you want that to be kind of a mandatory thing?
As many methods courses as possible, Nathan. And I do help design the curriculums now. I'm at a wonderful part of my career where I can have a say and everyone hates it. they're like, the students hate methods. It's really a struggle, right? I teach stats courses, and no student wants to be there. They're required to be there, and they're all scared of stats in the humanities and social sciences. I mean, that's the Canadian context in sociology, but in general, that's what a lot of my colleagues experience as well. And so you kind of have to fight this existing fear or disinterest. And I think that's always a struggle. But I always have students later on who say, like, that was the most useful course ever. I got jobs, or I find it super useful for doing, projects with others and things. And so it's kind of like the medicine might taste bad, but it's actually really important. I mean, listen, I trained I'll get us started here. I trained in stats for 10 years to be a quantitative specialist, right? I had to leave the country because Canada didn't have as much advanced training as there was elsewhere. So I went to the UK for that. I mean, so it's all, I think it's important in every discipline to have a good foundation of statistics, because we're exposed to them not just in research, but everywhere, right? Like polling data, consumer data, it's all being thrown at us. And there's a lot of important things to understand to be able to fully get what this data is telling us and not telling us. And so I think it's pretty important to have that foundation, but ideally, as much as someone's willing to take, basically.
Absolutely agree with Sarah. Sociologists and anthropologists sometimes are adverse to statistics, but also I want to add several things that I think it's really important. It doesn't have to be with strictly statistic training, which is do not forget that data is nothing without a good question. So we have to go back to try to formulate really good questions that really requires statistics data to be answered. So this is something important. And the second that I think that's important, and I try to teach in the course that I teach in a PhD program, is that data represents, in the case of the service data and census data, represents people, represents stories. So we, in a way, could qualitatively try to figure out with story data is telling us. It's not something easy to accomplish, but I think that it helps us to be a little more closer to statistics.
Yeah, that's coming out of that question, I guess have a further sort of question or prompt to others, is this question of communicating this data, communicating this statistics, and about sort of both sort of for different audiences, both disciplinary but also thinking within and beyond the academy as well. And I wondered whether anyone might reflect on the sort of challenges and opportunities of doing that in different ways.
Yeah, I can just jump in and then let others add to it. I mean, it's hard because when you're being trained in statistics, it's a very technical training, right? It's kind of like, okay, how do we use the software? How do we crunch number to answer the research questions, to test hypotheses, like Hugo was talking about? And we're actually not trained a whole lot to then think, like, how do we communicate that to non-experts? Because often I find it's a bit of a different mindset, right? It's like, how do I, like, if there's a big number, how do I communicate that in a way that someone can understand? So it's like, okay, every few seconds there's someone who dies of poverty, right? And there was a famous advert that did like that snapping thing. I mean, that's a really cool way of communicating really sad information, but it was a way that lots of people can understand, right? And so it's actually, you almost need time and effort to think about it sometimes. Like Todd did the nice word diagram, which is a nice visual, and we often try and use different types of visuals. And so it's really, I mean, and it takes time. So like you're at your start of your career, you're trying to get all the technical information to be able to run stats models. And then I find it was only kind of later on that I actually kind of really thought about, like, how do I actually communicate it? But that's when it needs, and that's when non-experts can help out. Like if you've got a historian on the team who doesn't know much about stats, but is like, okay, like, can you tell it to me in this way? It's like, okay, yeah, I can, because it's almost good to like have that as a conversation to figure out, like, what do you need from me to understand what I'm trying to communicate, right?
Todd, yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to mention, that I have my students, when we work on the 1960s, read the chapter from Callum Brown's book on the death of Christian Britain on the 60s. And he goes through really, it's a nice for teaching because Callum goes through like 3 different proofs, let's say, or 3 aspects of the same situation. And he ends it with statistical analyses, and I always ask the students, like, which is the most convincing of the 3 modes, and they find that the statistics always very convincing. And of course, as a cultural historian, I'm much more interested in like the first and second proof that he offers. But I think that to go also to the point just made, I mean, the visualizations are so important, I think, in terms of communication. That's something that statistics can provide, actually, if they're presented properly.
So I can see Peter's had his hand up, and then there's also a couple of questions in the chat. But Peter, go ahead.
Thank you very much for all 4 of those presentations. What I want to raise, my typical can of worms kind of thing, is this. We're focusing on worldviews that's come up in all the presentations, directly or indirectly, and implicitly in all of them. I particularly appreciate Todd Weir's analysis of the worldview becomes, in certain circumstances, very much of a political concept, right? Yet what we're talking about is using it as, well, call it a scientific concept, or maybe a philosophical one. And the question I want to ask is how do we gain some control over this operationalization process? That, I mean, nobody can tell you what a worldview is, or everybody can tell you what a worldview is, and there'll be 14,000 different answers. And yet we have to quantify, or some fine way to create concepts, questions, and stuff like that, that's going to translate that cloudy thing that's a worldview into something that we can actually analyze. And I know my involvement in this kind of work, I've always felt really out of control with that portion of it. For instance, in the NCF survey, we're talking about the process by which we came up with those questions and which questions to include. I thought that was not completely arbitrary, but it was a somewhat arbitrary selection from a million possibilities. And I wondered if our 4 interlocutors might be able to say something about how we might be able to get some kind of, the same kind of control over the operationalization and concept formation that we think we have when we actually use statistical tests.
Should I say something to that?
Yes.
It's a great question. I mean, it is so interesting with these emergent concepts. Of course, you can have a questionnaire. You ask something, implying a shared understanding of a concept, like belief, worldview, such things. And of course, you ultimately don't have control over it exactly, right? So there will be different answers, even if you just give people numbers to answer with. They're obviously referring to different concepts when they read what you've written. So in a sense, no, you can't pin it down, because these things are in flux and they're all polysemous. The interesting thing about something like worldview is that if you use statistics, you can find out the patterns of usage. So, the point being, there are really 10,000 definitions of worldview. Everyone can come up with their own. Somebody says it's foreign policy, like that's totally, not a mainstream historical approach to worldview. Worldview is always about religion, actually, if you look at it historically. And you can do statistical analyses and determine that is the case, right? That it usually has to do with religion. And that's what we've tried to do, right? By looking at sort of the broad swath of usage in history. So you can use statistics to narrow down historical usage of these concepts.
It's a question of faith, Peter. It's like Bruno Latour says in how we never have been modern, scientific knowledge is more magical than religious beliefs. But yeah, to have control of this is very difficult. But the truth is that the same thing could be asked about non-religion. Someone talks about non-religion in his question in the chat, or even about religion. So
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a matter of faith.
Well, I was going to jump in and say this is an issue for all types of research, not just stats, right? I mean, I don't know if I'd use the term control. I mean, we as researchers have a certain amount of power that we use when we formulate the question in a certain way and ask it in a certain way and give certain answer options to select from. So that is a way of sometimes normalizing certain ways of thinking. So I think, for example, the way we've been asking the gender question here in Canada in the last few years has changed, right? And that is a way not only to ask people with a greater diversity of gender identities, but also of normalizing a certain way of thinking about gender identity, right? And we're a small part of that process. But I mean, at the same time, to come back a bit to what Hugo pointed out earlier, is that the research question drives the method, right? For me, it's as long as you're clear about how you're defining something, you define it according to what you need it for, right? For what you want to know. And obviously you take into account everything that Todd was discussing. And I mean, that's just the best we can do. And there's always going to be diversity of those definitions and those operationalizations. But that's fine. That's part of our field. And I actually like that diversity. I don't want a set way of thinking about something because that, again, is kind of closing the box a bit to other possibilities, right?
So I can that I think some of those really brilliant answers have started to sort of, I think, answer hopefully to an extent Tomoko and Christina's questions. So because it has been liked and hearted, I'll finish, I guess, maybe with this question of the use of using quantitative and qualitative approaches together. The question is, can they work together? And also, I suppose how maybe you have had experience of them working together. Callum, would you like to kick us off?
Well, I don't think you can ever get rid of qualitative. Draws the context. I was trying to work out how to send a message to KL. I don't know who KL is, but he or she has asked about social stigmas affecting the way people reply to questions, particularly about being non-religious. And it just reminded me that there's a fantastic article by a pair of American sociologists about 2006. I can't remember the name of the lead woman who did it. It'll come to me in a minute. It's memory going. Where they investigated the issue of regularly 40 to 44% of American adults claiming to have been to church in the last 7 days, and which is everybody knows is quite patently involves a vast amount of lying. And so they worked out by doing sample studies in various parts of the states, and they came to a truer figure. They said that they thought the true figure was in the region of 22 to 23% attended church, synagogue, what have you, in the last 7 days. And they attributed the difference, that is about 20% of American non-church goers claiming to go to church, as one of the great national lies that Americans tell themselves. I think it's a fantastic. There's a similar one that was done on Canada, by the way, by Gallup. Gallup, in I think it's 1947, asked their traditional question, have you been to church, synagogue, blah, blah, in the last 7 days? And they came up with an answer of 67%. I mean, astonishing, and quite patently another lie. I mean, but it's a question of the level of lying, which indicates an interaction between statistical method and knowing damn well that, use the word, that they're not telling, there are people telling what in Britain would be classified as porkies, lies.
Is it? I think I found it by Hadaway and Marler. Does that sound right?
That's the one. That's the one. Yes, yes.
Great. I popped that in the chat, a link to that, or a link at least to the abstract. So hopefully people can follow that up. Thank you, Callum.
Really, it's a really interesting article. Yeah.
I mean, the one in Canada was from the 1940s and 50s, though, right, Callum? That level?
Yes, that was the Gallup.
Was like before 60s, yeah.
Yeah. It was, I think it was 47.
We haven't seen those levels, even of lying, for a long time.
I think Kirk and Hadaway did it in Ontario as well.
Did they do Ontario? Yeah.
I think it was in Brant County, to be specific. Yeah. But I can't find that reference at the moment.
Yeah, but I mean that's an interesting interaction between people trying to confer some kind of religious respectability upon themselves, and willing to breach one of the Ten Commandments to do it. I mean,
what we call social desirability bias, if you want the technical term. Yeah.
oh, Sarah,
it also comes out if you ask people how often they work out or how much money they make. Yeah, they lie.
Yeah, yeah.
Not just other people, to themselves. They want to think of themselves as that better person, right?
All right. Oh, I rather suspect that British people predominantly actually underjudge confess to their earnings. Maybe that'd be an interesting international comparison. Do some countries exaggerate their earnings and others say, "No, I'm really very poor."
So just to come back to the quant-qual combination, the mixed methods question, because it's a great one. I've been involved in a lot of mixed methods projects where there's been qualitative interviews and participant observations and then quantitative survey data. It can work really well together. It takes a lot of thought ahead of time to make sure it does, to make, because often qualitative and quantitative researchers, they're thinking a bit differently in terms of how they're using theory, what they want to get from people. And so it takes, you have to really build in time. And I've always done it in the framework of teamwork because everyone has extensive expertise that they bring to the table. And it's hard for one person to do all of that in one career or one training. And so they come together, but it really takes like a lot of sit down to make the two work together and plans about like, okay, how are we gonna run the survey before the interviews or the participant offshoot? How is each type of data gonna feed the other to answer again the research question we want to answer? And so I think it comes out with better quality findings, more well-rounded, holistic findings, if you want to call them that. But it does take extra effort throughout, and especially at the start to get it to work. Yeah.
And also more money.
And well, yeah, that's a given. Some
That's
money.
true.
I mean, it depends how much time people are willing to give. But yeah, money helps.
Yeah, but yeah, that sense of time to do it well, and like, and so as Hugo says, so like, it's about having the right questions, and to have the right questions, actually having a lot of conversations across disciplines to actually really dig down into what are we asking here, and how might different people go about answering these, and how might bringing those together give us a richer, fuller sense of the answers, hopefully. I think we are just past the hour, so I think I am going to close the conversation, much as the chat is suddenly getting very sort of exciting and chatty, and so I won't close the room immediately, because so people can look that over, because I know otherwise that all disappears into the ether. Just as a kind of closing, firstly, to thank all four of you for your generosity in sharing your reflections. So thank you so much. And please, applaud in whatever way you can through your Zoom screens. I'd like to just draw attention to the next couple of ISHASH webinars that are happening, and then I'll just quickly hand over back to Nathan for some other sort of things that are happening on their side as well. But the next ISHASH seminar is on Wednesday, the 7th of May, and that's Eva Patzelt, who will be presenting and discussing her very recent book, Scientific Atheism in East Germany, 1963 to 1990, How to Turn a Hare into a Lion, which is a brilliant subtitle for a book. And then on the 18th of June, we have some of the editors and contributors to a new open access volume on the non-religious and the state, seculars crafting their lives in different frameworks from the age of revolution to the current day. And that in and of itself actually is a volume which really does reach across the sort of history and social sciences. So hopefully will be of great interest to everyone here. And I've just put in the chat the link to our seminar information, so you can look at that again. Nathan.
Thank you. I just popped a link in the chat as well. We've got with the NCF, we've got an event coming up in a couple weeks. If you haven't had your fill of statistics in the seminar, there's another one coming up. It's on April 22nd. It's about the Pew Research Center released a new study a little while ago called the Religious Landscape Study. And there, Greg Smith, who was the one who kind of led this study, he's going to kind of give an overview. Then we'll hear from some comments from NCF team members, Kati Turvo Niemela, Peter Beyer, and Ryan Cragen. So hopefully people join that one. So it's April 22nd, 11 a.m. Eastern, and I included the link to register. Otherwise, I don't know if Claire, if you want to wrap up or if you want me to. Okay. Well, thanks again to our four panelists and everyone who joined. It's really interesting discussion. I think we definitely learned a lot and kind of covered a lot of ground. So thank you so much, and hope to see you at a future event.
Thanks so much,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Have a nice evening or
Thank
rest of the day.